This portion of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it has to do with sex and marriage. I gave a brief introduction and preview to this last week, just to give you some peace. You should not be worried. My wife is here, so I can't say anything that would be too bad. But more importantly, my 11-year-old son is sitting right there in the front row. So this has to be PG-11, at least, right? And so hopefully this is insightful. Hopefully this is insightful for you and for him. And most importantly, we want to learn from God about marriage and about sex. I said this last week, and I think it's worth repeating just in case you weren't here. I think that we live in a world that's very confused. I think this may be the most confusing time in history. It seems like the most simple questions that we have a hard time answering. And it seems like in the attempt to be God, that we've just become so confused. And what I mean by in the attempt to be God is in trying to answer all of the questions and trying to figure out all the answers on our own by ourselves, without God, without God's word, without God's guidance, trying to be so smart, we've become so confused. And I think this is so true of even sex and marriage. So even today, we're going to go over some very basic things about marriage and sex. Because I think the world that we live in, where we are so confused, we're confused with the basics. And if you don't know the basics, then the other stuff is just going to be really, really confusing. So we're going to go over the basics because that's what Paul addresses here in 1 Corinthians 7. And again, because God is the one who created marriage and sex, it would make the most sense to turn to God and go to God into His Word for Him to teach us and for us to learn about marriage and sex. The last thing I'll say, and again, I said this last week, I think one of the things that has gone horribly wrong is that the church, instead of the church teaching the world about sex, it's almost become the opposite. The church is looking to the world to teach it about sex. And I think that's one of the reasons there's so much confusion and fear and when it comes to sex. And so today, hopefully, this passage of Scripture, this passage of truth will be helpful and insightful to you. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 9, this is the Word of God. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, so the Corinthians, they wrote a letter to the Apostle Paul, and they addressed 3 topics. But one of the topics is this sentence. This next sentence comes straight from their letter. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. I started this sermon last week, and last week, as all of you know, was Father's Day. And prerequisite to being a good father is being a good husband. And I encourage all of the men, all the husbands in this room to lead their families, to lead your families spiritually, but to lead even in your marriage. And I would encourage you after today to go home and to sit down and have a conversation with your spouse, with your wife, about today's sermon. I know that sex is an uncomfortable topic, but obviously it's an important topic, and it's an important part of marriage. And the reason I say that is, if it wasn't, God wouldn't have included it in the Bible. It's an important part of life. It's an important part of marriage. And I know it's kind of embarrassing, and it can be an uncomfortable and difficult conversation. But I said this last week, it's those difficult and uncomfortable conversations that are probably some of the most important conversations. And so I want to encourage you husbands to be, take courage and lead, and encourage you to sit down today with your wife and maybe have a conversation. Just one simple question. Well, let me start by saying that this topic is something that's very relevant to me, not just because I'm married, but I have a son who's 11 years old. And my wife and I, we've been talking about this because he's going to be going to middle school. And we know that in middle school that he's going to be exposed to a lot of new things and to a lot of new information. And we know that one of the things that he's going to be exposed to is sex, right? And so we've talked between ourselves, and I've asked, other people questions. What I've told my wife is this. I know that he's going to learn about sex. Like, he's going to. The question is, who and how is he going to learn it, right? Is he going to learn it from other people? Is he going to learn it from friends, right? Or is he going to learn about it from us? And not only who is he going to learn it from, but how or what is he going to learn about it? So I think there's two ways to learn about sex. Either it's bad, right? It's this, dark, secret thing, that you talk about with your friends. But, it's either bad or it's good. And I think how one is introduced to the topic of sex is really important. And so we've made Caleb, his face is like this already, right? It's like, oh no. So we've made the decision that we think it's really important that we are the ones that introduce him to sex. And so it's really good that he's here this morning because he gets to learn from his dad, right, and his pastor what God created sex for. But again, it's really important who you learn it from. But again, what do you learn about it? Is it good or is it bad? And that's kind of where this first question comes from. And in verse 1, the Corinthians, they wrote Paul a letter. And in this letter, there was a sentence. And the sentence read, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, we don't know exactly why they wrote this sentence. Again, maybe they had this thought that sex was bad. It was just a bad thing. It was dirty. Whether you're married or unmarried, it's just bad. And so it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, right? Or maybe there were some people in the church that thought that the more mature, the more spiritual Christians, they didn't need sex, right? It was a sign of spiritual maturity. And so they wrote, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So that's what they thought. And that's the question that they asked the Apostle Paul. So the question that you need to answer this question. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Is the answer to that question yes or no? It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Well, more important than how we answer it is how the Apostle Paul would answer it. And look how he answers it. He answers, "But Because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. So if you hear what he's saying, he answers affirmative. He says yes. He says, yes, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And I was kind of surprised, because sex was created by God. It was created to be a good thing. And so when I first kind of read this, I was kind of surprised that the Apostle Paul writes, it is good. Listen, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And he answers, but. He says, but there's a yes there. Yes, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality. We'll get back to that, but to see that he does think it's good not to have sex, if you look at verse 8, when the Apostle Paul speaks to the unmarried and to widows, he says, listen, that first line, it is good. Remember, that's how the phrase starts, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Then in verse 8, he says, it is good for the unmarried and for the widows to remain single as I am. It is good. And so it's just further evidence that the Apostle Paul's answer to the question, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, he actually says yes. Let me start by addressing verse 8. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. It is good for them to remain single. It is good to remain single. Let me give you two examples of what I think the Apostle Paul is talking about. Soon after getting married, my wife and I, we were at church and we were worshiping. And I don't remember what song we were singing, but I felt very moved by the Spirit of God. You all know I'm a hand raiser, so I'm pretty sure my hands were probably raised in the air, and I was worshiping God, and I was so moved by the Spirit of God. I think in my heart I was saying, oh God, I will die for you. I said, God, I will die for you. But then I paused and I thought, maybe I should ask my wife what she thinks about that. Because I wasn't used to being married. Right? I wasn't used to thinking about another person. I was used to being single. I was used to just, making my decisions all by myself. I didn't have to consult another person. I didn't have to worry about what another person thought. But also I was like, wow, it's not as simple as just dying anymore. I should ask my wife what she thinks about that. Recently, I spoke to a medical student, and this individual was interested in going on a medical mission trip for some length of time. And this person was seeking counsel from a lot of different people about what he should do. And he was told that maybe you should just wait until you've finished all your studies and then go. Instead of going right now, this person was going to take a break for about a year. And but he said, instead of going now, he said, maybe you should go after your studies are all done. And I told this individual, I don't know you very well, and I would definitely listen to the counsel of the people that God has placed in your life. And so I'm not saying that they're wrong, but if I could give you a little bit, of different counsel, my counsel would be go while you have the opportunity. Because in life, you never know what's going to happen, even tomorrow. But you definitely don't know what's going to happen 1, 2, or 3 years later. You just never know what's going to happen. The opportunity may not be there, right? So while you have the opportunity, why don't you go? Especially, who knows, right now this individual is single. I said, you might be married. And if you're married, what if your wife doesn't want to go? It's just not that simple. It's not as easy, right? I joke about it, half serious, half jokingly. What I tell single people, and you've heard me say this to young adults and college students, I said, if you're single, just go and serve God and die. It's so much easier. Even dying, if you're married and have kids, it's more complicated. You have to worry about your wife. You have to worry about your children, right? And if you're single, I'm not saying people aren't going to care. Obviously people will care, but it's a lot more difficult. It is. It's a lot more difficult to die. It's a lot more complicated. Man, if you're single, you can really give yourself fully. You don't really have to worry about anything or anyone. There's a real blessedness to being single. Just this just reckless abandon, just to give yourself fully to God. I think that's what the Apostle Paul is talking about when he says it is good. It really is. It is good for the unmarried and for the widows to remain single. If you're single now, serve God just to the fullest, right? It's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity. So I'm going to go back. We're going to go back to the Corinthians question. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. He says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. In verse 2, the Apostle Paul gives us and repeats the definition of marriage. The definition of marriage is each man, one man should have his own wife. Not just a wife, okay? But his own wife, right? And each woman, one woman, her own husband. Okay? Marriage was instituted by God. Marriage was created by God. And marriage was created by God to be between one man and one woman, right? A man should have his own wife, right? And a woman her own husband. Again, in verse 2, we're given the definition of marriage. And again, it's a real basic, but again, I think there's a lot of confusion about what it is to be married and even what the Bible says about marriage. But it's in this context of marriage that sexual relations are permitted. And so, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Clearly, the answer to that phrase is yes. But I'll tell you what, it is good for a husband to have sexual relations with his wife. The answer to that question would be yes. Sex is good. Sex and marriage were created by God. But sex was created by God for marriage, for the covenant of marriage. And so if you're a man or a woman, right, and you're outside of the covenant of marriage, then it is good not to have sexual relations, because you're just a man and a woman. But if you're a different kind of man and a different kind of woman, if you're a husband and a wife, then the Bible would say that it is good. Not only is it good, but the Bible would even say, God would even teach us, you should have sexual relations with your husband or your wife. So each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. A man and a woman. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. I want to spend some time on verse 4, because I think verse 4 may be a little bit confusing. It may be a little bit upsetting to some of you at first read. Especially it starts off, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Now, I think it's possible that there's some ladies in this room that might be a little bit worried about that statement. You might be worried because maybe this statement could lead to abuse, right? Maybe the church has used this statement and it's kind of been taken out of context or misunderstood. Let me say, this is a good thing. Let me start by showing you that it's not just limited to the woman. Not only does the wife not have authority over her own body, but likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body. Right? So it's the same for both the wife and for the husband. Second, think about the word authority. Now, most people, and most of you, when you think about the word authority, what's the first word that comes to mind? Power. Am I right? Am I wrong? Power? I think it's power. But that's not the real, that's not the essence of authority. Think about the people you have authority over. If you're a parent, you have authority over your child, right? Now, if you have authority over your child, do you exercise power? Do you exercise authority? Do you have power over your child or your children? The answer would be yes. But there's a reason you have power. The reason you have that power is because you are responsible to care for that individual. Authority implies responsibility and care. If you have authority over an individual or individuals, it means that it is your responsibility to care, to nurture that person or those persons. None of you would say that I have authority over my kids, so I can make my kids do whatever I want. I could use them, I can abuse them, I can use them as labor. I don't think any parent here thinks about parental authority that way. Now again, is it true that you have power over your children? The answer is yes. But you have authority over them because it is your responsibility to care for them. It does not mean, authority does not imply taking advantage of the one you have authority over. It doesn't mean taking from the one you have authority over. Actually, if you have authority over an individual or individuals, it really means giving. It means you giving. It means you sacrificing. See, this is where all of our kids are going to be so shocked and surprised when they become adults. Because all kids, they just can't wait to become adults, right? Why? Because they think that when they become an adult, they can do anything and everything they want to do. When I become an adult, I can do anything and I can do everything I want to do. And when you become an adult, you realize that there is more that you probably can't do than you can do because you have responsibilities. You have responsibilities over other people. Not only your family, but as you get older, your sphere of influence grows. Hopefully it grows. That's a good thing. But you can't do whatever you want. There's a lot of times, maybe most of the time, you can't do what you want. And you give. See, authority is not about taking. Authority is about giving. See, you all know this, but we forget it. Marriage is about giving yourself. When you get married, what you are doing is you are giving yourself to another individual. If you're a man, you are giving yourself to your wife. If you're a woman, you are giving yourself to your husband. You are giving yourself not only in soul, but you are also giving your body. You are giving yourself both body and soul in marriage. And so, the wife does not have authority over her own body. You gave that authority to your husband when you married him. And the husband does not have authority over his own body because he gave that authority over to her when he married her. It's about giving. Please hear this correctly. That does not mean that you can take whatever you want. Sex is not about taking. Sex is about giving. It's about giving to your husband or wife. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says in verse 3. In verse 3, the husband should give. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise, the wife should give to her husband. See, sex is not about taking. Sex is about giving. I gave this example last week when I gave an example about my son's baseball immorality. I'll give it to you really quickly again. I have a 5-year-old. He just started playing baseball this year, and playing baseball with him is not a whole lot of fun because he makes up his own rules as he goes, right? He'll make up his own rules. He doesn't have to touch every base, right? And he thinks he's having a great time. He loves playing baseball and making up his own rules, but nobody else enjoys it. Everyone else wants to quit because he's selfish. It's all about him. And I call that baseball immorality. See, sexual immorality, it's all about you. It's about me. It's not about anybody else. It's just about me. What can I get from it? It's all about me. That's sexual immorality. Because the way God created sex, it's not just about you. Actually, it's about giving yourself to the other individual. It's about giving yourself. And that's why sex outside of the covenant of marriage is immoral. Because it's all about you. It's all about you. And that's immoral. That's not why God created sex. That's not how God intended sex to be used. And so, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Hopefully you understand why there's a yes. Yes. If you're a man or a woman, but it is good for a husband to have sexual relations with his wife. The answer would be yes. Right? Sex is not about taking, it's about giving. It's about giving. So much so in verse 5, do not deprive one another. The Apostle Paul in the Bible assumes that sex is a normal part of marriage. But, I like this, it says 4, do not deprive one another, except, this is an exception, except perhaps by agreement. There's a lot of conditions here, right? Except perhaps by agreement for a limited time. He says that you may devote yourselves to prayer. To fully give yourself to God. To really fully give yourself to God. But come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I'd say this, if you're not married, a good prayer I think this passage teaches is a prayer of self-control. God, would you give me self-control? God, would you give me... And again, even if you are married, again, because sex is not about taking. It's about receiving when the other gives. It's about, God, give me self-control. In verse 6, I'm going to end with this, it says, now as a concession, I say this not as a command. Concession means permission. And so what he's talking about there is that for a limited time, that exception, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. That's the concession, right? The Apostle Paul says, I'll give permission for you to do that, but again, for a limited time. I'm going to end by the way I started. I think it's a real loving thing for a husband to have a conversation with his wife about sex. It's important. It's important because sex and marriage were created by God, and they're so important because there is no better picture of the relationship that God wants with his people than what you see in marriage and the joy in sex. And that's why this area is so important. So let me end by, this will be really clean, but it's kind of funny hopefully, but kind of, so recently my wife and I, we had a conversation. And in the conversation, my wife said to me, fill in the lines. We had a conversation, okay? Right? And so, she said to me, she goes, Brendon, I think you're getting old. And I go, what do you mean? She goes, you're starting to smell. And I go, I don't smell? I go, I've never smelled. I took great offense to this. And she's been telling me this for a while. I mean, but I go, what are you talking about? I don't smell. I never smell. And she's like, I think you're getting old. And I'm like, what are you talking about? But then, I thought to myself, if she tells me I smell, then why would she lie to me, right? I mean, does she just want to make me feel bad for some reason? And so, like my mom even said, if she says you smell, you smell. It's just like, she's like, why would she lie to you? And it makes a lot of sense, right? So husbands, right? If your wife tells you something, why would they lie to you about it? But I don't know. I have these control issues, I guess. And I do. I won't lie. And so it's like, oh, man. And so I started, so she's bought deodorant like probably years, right? But all of a sudden I've started using deodorant, right? And I used to shower in the morning, but now I shower at night. So I shower at night and I use deodorant. Not a huge deal, but I know my wife really appreciates it. But the amazing thing is my kids will crawl into bed and they'll actually come to my side now. And they'll say, Dad, you smell good. And I'll be like, well, maybe I did smell, It's so funny because they used to just stay on, Gia inside the bed. I'm like, why do they not like me? And it's so funny because now they're like, Dad, you smell good. I'm like, oh, wow, that's great. And, it's a small thing, but it all started with a conversation. It started with a conversation. And it's been really good. It's been good for our marriage. It's been good for our relationship. It started with a conversation. And so I want to encourage you. Again, husbands, just one sentence. Start a simple conversation. How we doing? However you want. And it could be a short conversation. Hey, if your wife doesn't want to have a long conversation about it, then keep it short, right? But you never know. But, the one thing, if anything, that the beauty of marriage and sex that this passage teaches is about giving. And it is. You know why it's about giving? Because that's what God does. God gives. God is a God who gives. God gives and God gives. And God gave his son, Jesus Christ, so that we could have him, so that we could be married to him, that we could have pleasure with God. See, that's the thing with marriage. See, when we start with marriage, when you first get married, this is a secret. When you first get married, you want to give. How can I serve? How can I serve? How can I serve? You wake up in the morning, you really think that, right? How can I give? But the longer you're married, you're like, what can I get? What can I get? What can I get? And that's why marriage goes bad. Because marriage is not about getting. It's about giving. And the reason marriage is about giving, the reason sex is about giving, is because that's what God is. God's a God who gives. That we might be more like God. That our marriages would be more like God. And the world would see God in our marriages. Would you pray with me as we close today? Oh, God, thank you.